7 on CNN. This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
They packed the Kremlin Hall to hear Gorbachev, who warned that the United States wants Star Wars more than the ABM Treaty. A Kremlin peace forum attended by known figures from some 80 nations. A shadow figure from Treblinka on trial for his life in Israel this morning.
This is Daybreak on CNN for Monday, February 16th. With Reid Collins in Washington and Marianne Loughlin and Bob Cain in Atlanta.
Good morning. A former auto worker from Cleveland, Ohio, went on trial for his life in Jerusalem today, charged with being the infamous Ivan the Terrible of Poland's Treblinka concentration camp. John Demjanjuk was stripped of his American citizenry and sent to Israel a year ago. He claims you've got the wrong man, that he fought with the Russians during the war and was captured and was himself a prisoner of the Nazis at the time 850,000 were marching to the gas chambers in Treblinka. A key and controversial piece of evidence in this trial, an identification card given the Israelis by Armand Hammer, who has close ties to the Kremlin. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev took the floor in Moscow today before an 80-nation peace forum, selling the Kremlin's new approach to human rights, but also sounding familiar criticisms of the Reagan administration. Gorbachev repeated his condemnation of Star Wars, charged the United States wants to scrap the ABM treaty so it can go on to test space weapons. Indeed, said Gorbachev, the U.S. is trying to trample underfoot past agreements to encourage arms control talks. And he disagreed with those Americans who now assessed last year's Iceland summit as a failure.
It was not a failure. It was a breakthrough. These were not just, this was not just another round of negotiations. This was the opening of a new prospect of embarking on the way towards a nuclear-free world.
Gorbachev stressed again the proposals put forward by the Soviet side in Iceland and called again for disarmament by the end of this century. Well, that summit in Iceland last year was a textbook case on how the superpower should not negotiate. Democratic Congressman Les Aspin of Wisconsin said last night. Aspin issued a 30-page report from his defense policy panel that said the White House was in confusion and disarray at the time of the meeting, offering proposals never discussed with the allies or advisors. A conservative member of the panel, the California Republican Congressman Duncan Hunter, issued a dissenting opinion calling the panel report political sniping. Not every American was planted in front of the television set last night watching America with a K, that ABC miniseries depicting life in the United States under Soviet rule. A few were on the streets demonstrating for or against the program. Protesters assembled outside the United Nations last night, denouncing the broadcast as absurd fantasy and right-wing propaganda. The UN has objected to America's portrayal of UN troops as Soviet thugs. Demonstrators said they feared the movie would hurt the public support for the UN. University of Maryland students demonstrated in Washington. The local ABC affiliate reported sidewalk sentiment both for and against the broadcast. A group of young Republicans proclaiming better dead than red and live free or die. People against the miniseries staged a die-in outside another television station in Atlanta, complaining of World War III, brought to you by ABC. The 14-and-a-half-hour miniseries will run all week and conclude next Sunday. The wife of the Soviet dissident Yosef Begun tells CNN she believes her husband still is in jail, despite yesterday's assurances from the Kremlin that Begun had been freed. The 54-year-old electronics engineer was jailed in 1983 for anti-Soviet agitation. Begun got 7 years, to be followed by 5 years internal exile. After last week's tumultuous Moscow demonstrations on his behalf, the Soviet official Georgy Arbatov appeared on American television yesterday to announce that Begun had been freed. Today, Begun's family says no, he's still behind bars as far as it knows. His son Boris says, contrary to Arbuthnot's assurances, prison officials say they still have Begun and have not been told to release him yet.
4 minutes past the hour. Israel's prime minister begins a 10-day visit to the United States today. Yitzhak Shamir is scheduled to arrive in New York this morning and will travel to Washington for high-level talks with U.S. officials. Those talks are expected to include sessions on Israel's role in the Iran-Contra affair. Before leaving Tel Aviv yesterday, Shamir announced that the United States has granted Israel official ally status. That move by the U.S. is expected to result in expanded military cooperation between the two nations.
One of the 3 directors of the Nicaraguan Contra alliance is expected to resign today. Rebel officials in Miami say Adolfo Calero is quitting under pressure from rival Contra leaders and the Reagan administration. Calero is considered to be the most conservative director of the United Nicaraguan Opposition, the coalition that directs the Contras with the support of the U.S. One supporter says Calero's departure is a victory for more moderate Contra leaders trying to broaden the group's base. But other rebel leaders say Calero will still play a big role in directing the Contras as head of the largest rebel army operated by the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, or FDN. The presidents of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica have wrapped up a peace meeting in San Jose, Costa Rica. The presidents failed to agree on a Costa Rican proposal to end the guerrilla wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador. But they did agree to meet in Guatemala in 90 days to try again. They also agreed to invite Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega to the meeting. Ortega was not asked to attend yesterday's peace talks. Nicaragua's Sandinista government criticized yesterday's meeting as a U.S.-backed attempt to isolate Nicaragua politically and economically.
In Louisiana, a woman died yesterday when a tornado overturned her mobile home, pinning her beneath it. As many as a dozen tornadoes touched down over the weekend in the Gulf Coast states and in the Southwest. Oklahoma and Texas were battered by rain, wind, and hail. In Medicine Park near Lawton, Oklahoma, 8 homes were destroyed and more than 30 others were damaged. A church was destroyed. There was tornado damage in Mississippi and in Texas, where the roof was torn off a restaurant in Houston. Flood warnings were posted in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. Cold was the problem this weekend in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. The thermometer hit 30 below in Watertown, New York on Sunday. It was 21 below in Alpena, Michigan, 22 below in Burlington, Vermont. In New York City, an elderly couple died in a fire that started when a kerosene heater exploded. Authorities said the heater may have been fueled with a volatile mixture of kerosene and gasoline. The New York Auto Club fielded almost 3,000 calls from motorists who were stranded by the cold.
7 minutes past the hour, and for a preview look at how the weather is shaping up on this day after all that bad weather, Valerie.
Continue, and just as the world around us goes on.
This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
This is Day Watch on CNN for Monday, February 16th. With Reid Collins in Washington, Marianne Loughlin and Bob Cain in Atlanta, and Lynn Brown in New York.
Good morning. The Soviet leader Gorbachev condemned the United States Star Wars defense program again today. He told an 80-nation peace forum in Moscow the space-based program raised the risk of nuclear war. Gorbachev said the United States is proposing a broadening aspect of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in Geneva so that Star Wars technology could be tested in space. He said the point of issue really is the scrapping of the ABM treaty itself. The Soviet leader, sounding a familiar theme, said it was time the arms race ended.
Any country, the USSR, the Soviet Union, cannot use nuclear weapons because it would mean condemning mankind to death. We are not judging these. This is simply a question of moral choice.
A number of celebrities are attending this international forum for a world without nuclear arms in Moscow. Among the attendants, Gregory Peck and Yoko Ono, who deny charges the forum is simply a Soviet propaganda ploy.
We're
going to take to the next century human love, human wisdom, and human unity, which is what we need.
It's a mature group of people. No possible harm can come from this gathering, and it's possible that a considerable amount of good may come of it.
There are 900 delegates attending the forum, and it began on Saturday. An Ohio anthropologist has his own ideas about how to bring it on an end to the superpower arms race. J. Kenneth Smale told the American Association for the Advancement of Science that a peace hostage swap of 1 million Soviets for 1 million Americans could help reduce tensions and provide a strong deterrence to war. He says the volunteer peace hostages would serve 2-year tours of duty in one another's country. He estimates the cost about $20 billion a year, but says that's nothing compared to what is spent on weapons annually. A new congressional report is calling that October summit between the president and Soviet leader Gorbachev in Iceland a textbook case on how the superpowers should not negotiate. The 30-page study was released over the weekend by Wisconsin Democrat Les Aspin, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. The report says the decision to accept the Soviet proposal for a quick summit in Reykjavik and efforts then to put a favorable spin on the outcome shows the White House in, quote, confusion and disarray. This Defense Policy Panel report says Mr. Reagan's proposal to eliminate all ballistic missiles within 10 years caused the most problems since it was done with the knowledge the implications of it had not been considered by the Pentagon or U.S. allies. What scientist is now saying the laser systems developed for the President's Star Wars program could have offensive capability. Carolyn Herzenberg's a physicist at the Argonne National Laboratories in Illinois, and she says the lasers could be used to attack planes or set fires to cities. The president has denied the missile defense system ever would be used for any offensive purposes.
It's 3 minutes past the hour. Relatives of Joseph Begun dispute a Soviet official's claim that the Jewish Soviet dissident has been freed from prison. A small group of demonstrators staged 5 days of protests in central Moscow last week, demanding Begun's release. Plainclothes security agents attacked that crowd on Thursday and Friday. In an interview televised in the U.S. yesterday, top Kremlin advisor Georgy Albatov announced that Begun had been freed. But Begun's wife and son say Soviet Interior Ministry officials told them today that he's still in prison. Begun is serving a 7-year sentence for teaching Hebrew, a crime in the Soviet Union.
The trial of retired U.S. auto worker John Demjanjuk has opened in Jerusalem. This is the first Nazi war crimes trial in Israel in a quarter century, and security is very tight. Demjanjuk is accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a guard who tortured and gassed to death 850,000 Jews in Poland during World War II. Demjanjuk was arrested in this country and extradited to Israel a year ago. His attorney claims Demjanjuk should not be tried in Israel because the crimes of which he's accused took place in Europe before Israel existed.
Quite obviously, the gentleman was never in Troutnicki, which most people know now, in any capacity, much less one of the greatest war criminals of all time, and that it's a great tragedy that Israel was forced into a position of taking international jurisdiction in this case when the United States should have used its moral responsibility to try the man right there.
The same argument was used before at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was convicted. Demjanjuk's son traveled to Jerusalem from the United States for the trial.
Our war criminal, he's an innocent person. He's not belong here in Israel. Unfortunately, we've not received justice in the United States. We are here in Israel. However, we believe and we're looking forward to the day when my father will be back home in the United States with us as rightly he should be.
What makes you so confident, sir?
Well, I have faith in God, number one. Number two, I have faith in our legal counsel that they have the ability to prove to the Israeli people and the rest of the world that my father is an innocent man.
Demjanjuk is charged under the 1950 Nazis and Nazi collaborators law, the only law that carries the death penalty in Israel.
Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir is in New York on his first visit to the U.S. since the Iran arms deal surfaced. Shamir leaves tomorrow for Washington, where he says he will cooperate with investigations into the scandal. He says he has nothing to hide and that Israel acted in accordance with its conscience. Just before Shamir's departure last night, the Reagan administration elevated Israel's status to that of an official U.S. ally. The action clears the way for official military cooperation between the two countries. Meanwhile, Lebanon's President Amin Gemayel is in Britain, where he will meet today with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Gemayel, who met yesterday with Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe, could cast no fresh light on the whereabouts of Terry Waite. Gemayel has promised his help in the search for the Anglican envoy who disappeared in Beirut nearly 1 month ago. Lebanon's Druze militia chief, Walid Jumblat, charges that Waite is a hostage of the pro-Iranian group Hezbollah.
Coming up on Day Watch, a report on and a discussion of the issue, who should know when a person is found to have AIDS.
Also a look at the nation's weather picture with Valerie Ross coming up.
Now back to Day Watch on CNN.
The recent controversies surrounding the death of entertainer Liberace and the suspension of a Chicago doctor with AIDS have called attention to a problem in medical ethics. In the first of a new Monday series called At Issue, Luann Sanders looks at the public's right to know versus the patient's right to privacy.
Medical records are considered sacred by the medical world, but some argue the confidential relationship between doctor and patient should end when the patient has AIDS. In the case of Liberace, the privacy exception was said to be a legal one. A California coroner investigated the cause of death and reported that the entertainer had indeed died of AIDS.
Where, gentlemen, you have the cause of death in layman's terms, they did die of AIDS.
Officials have argued that just because Liberace was a celebrity didn't mean they shouldn't treat the case as they would any other. But that argument has been turned around in the case of a Cook County hospital doctor with the disease. Despite the fears of county officials, some physicians argue that a doctor with AIDS has the same rights to privacy as does any other victim.
It's not a question of different standards for different individuals.
The AIDS disclosure issue seems to boil down to one important question. To what degree does the victim pose a threat to others? Officials in Cook County argue the threat posed by a physician may be bigger than perceived.
It has been known that surgical gloves will break, or that he will cut himself, or that he will stick a sharp instrument through the glove and wind up cutting his finger.
The goal of AIDS disclosure is to protect society, but misconceptions about the disease may be hyped in the process, making life difficult for victims who only have a few years left. Still, those in favor of disclosure argue this can't be helped, that the social effects are as ugly as the side effects when it comes to AIDS. Luann Sanders, CNN reporting.
We have two guests scheduled to join us on this morning's discussion of what is at issue, and that is the public's right to know versus the patient's right to privacy in the matter of AIDS or carriers of the AIDS virus. Joining us in our Washington, D.C. bureau is Jeff Levi. He is the executive director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Good morning, Mr. Levi.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. And scheduled to join us in our San Francisco bureau is Dr. Lawrence White. He's chairman of the Board of Trustees of the California Medical Association. So far, we don't have Dr. White with us, but if he joins us, even midway through the discussion, we will turn to him. Let me begin, Mr. Levi, with the question that helped generate this morning's discussion. Should there, and that is the Liberace affair, actually, is what I think drew it to main public attention, should there be such a thing as privacy after death?
Yes, I think there should be. I think the stigmatization that's associated with AIDS is so great that it carries over not just to the individual, but to the individual's family as well. And so I think there needs to be a right to privacy. For an organization like mine that is working so hard to overcome the stigmatization associated with AIDS, to a certain extent, we want people to know that average people and famous people do indeed get AIDS. Unfortunately, the stigmatization associated with it makes the right to privacy, it's important for that right to privacy to be paramount, even though knowing about more and more people with AIDS would help overcome that stigmatization. In a certain sense, it's a catch-22.
Then why don't you go that way? Given, for example, that AIDS is becoming more and more recognized as a not necessarily gay disease, would that not lessen the stigmatization that you talk about, and wouldn't it be all to the good?
It certainly would lessen the stigmatization, but I think ultimately there's a right to privacy. I think people need to choose when important things about their lives are revealed, whether it's that they're gay or whether it's that they have AIDS. I think the example of the Cook County doctor is probably more relevant to this discussion than the Liberace example, because famous people, in a certain sense, fall into a slightly different category. There's no public health purpose served other than idle curiosity in revealing the cause of death or whether someone has AIDS or not. And I think ultimately we need to keep in mind the right to privacy.
It is your position then that even a doctor who is working with sometimes sharp, sometimes faulty equipment and with well patients, or at least patients who don't have AIDS, should have his anonymity protected?
Absolutely, and the relevant authorities within a hospital can make the relevant decisions. But the Public Health Service and every leading medical authority in this country has stated that there is no risk to the patient of a physician with AIDS or a healthcare worker with AIDS to be treating that person, assuming they take the appropriate precautions that are associated with any infectious disease.
You talk about the right to privacy. Isn't there a sense, isn't there a time, a point at which you can't compare, let's say, the privacy to withhold information about having AIDS with the privacy of withholding information that you had an abortion? An abortion is one thing. AIDS can kill you.
But what public health purpose is served in revealing that information? The public health, the ordinary routine contact that a person would have with a person with AIDS does not place him or her at risk. And so what purpose is served from a public health standpoint, and I assume that's the purpose of your question, in revealing that information?
All right. Do you see any circumstances under which society has a need to protect itself? And if so, by notifying whom? Should hospitals be told? Should hospital workers be told that this or that patient is carrying the AIDS virus?
Well, certainly where it is relevant to the management, the medical management of a patient, the medical people taking care of that patient need to know whether the person has AIDS or whether the person is infected. But that's not across the board. For example, there have been proposals that every hospital admission be tested. That's not necessary. If you're coming into the hospital with a broken leg, to care for that broken leg, people don't need to know whether or not you are infected. If that happens to be part of your medical record, or if you happen to have AIDS, clearly that needs to be known to the people caring for you so they can care for you appropriately.
All right. You obviously, I'm sure you accept the need to test the blood donor's blood for the AIDS antibody.
Oh, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that the list of blood donors who test positive needs to be published anywhere. I think the example of the Liberace case in California, I think that turned into a media circus. If the coroner was concerned that there had been some sort of deception in the handling of the death certificate by Liberace's doctors, he could have conducted that investigation quietly, conducted an autopsy quietly. He did not need to have the sort of press circus that was associated with it.
Well, you say press circus. Death certificate is a matter of public record, isn't it?
Absolutely, but the nature in which he carried out that investigation was designed, I believe, and I happened to have been out in California at the time and saw the local coverage there. The manner in which that investigation was conducted, I think, was more designed to get the coroner a lot of publicity than really to get to the true facts of the matter.
Did you feel he was too flamboyant? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. You don't need to call press conferences, and you don't need to give, hour-by-hour updates on your investigation in order to complete that kind of work.
AIDS victims die from a variety of causes. They don't die of AIDS. They die of causes related to the disease, things that they have become vulnerable to. As long as the Centers for Disease Control knows of the case, does it have to be listed on the death certificate, do you feel?
Well, I think the death certificate can indicate the immediate cause of death. I think as long as the Centers for Disease Control or the state health authorities know that the person had AIDS and that the person died, that's probably as much information as needs to be transmitted. Because the purpose for revealing this to public health authorities is so that they can keep track of the number of cases and the number of deaths. It's an epidemiological purpose. And so, indeed, most people who die of AIDS don't die of AIDS itself, but they may die of pneumonia or they may die of some other associated opportunistic infection, and that indeed can be the cause of death. And I think most people who are familiar with AIDS know that when that is the cause of death listed, that indeed the underlying cause is AIDS.
All right, Mr. Levy, we've just learned that technical difficulties between here and our San Francisco Bureau are going to prevent Dr. Lawrence White from appearing in this morning's discussion, so you will, if you will, continue to shoulder the rest of the burden for the remaining minutes. Let me ask you this. If there is good reason to believe the AIDS patient will lose benefits, such as insurance coverage, should employers be kept in the dark then?
Well, there is no real reason for an employer to know. Someone who's already covered by an insurance plan and who is diagnosed by AIDS will continue to be covered. The issue that arises in terms of insurability arises in the context of antibody testing. That's someone who is asymptomatic and who happens to test positive for infection with the AIDS-related virus. And the question there is whether insurance companies will in the future deny that person coverage if they find out, and if that's part of your medical record. That's clearly a major concern. Someone who has been diagnosed with AIDS certainly risks losing his job. There are many instances across the country where people with AIDS have been fired. The government itself is firing or refusing to send overseas or limiting the careers of people who have been infected with the virus. So that kind of employment discrimination exists across the board and is a serious concern. And if we are going to manage this problem as a public health problem, if we're going to encourage people to get the care and the counseling and the testing that they may need to control this epidemic, then we have to eliminate the associated stigmatization, the associated discrimination, so that people will indeed cooperate in these efforts. And certainly a ban on firing people who have AIDS or firing people who are infected with the AIDS-related virus is a critical part of that, and we don't see that.
Let me interrupt you for just a second. We're down to our last question and answer, and the one thing that we haven't gotten yet, I think, I understand where you're coming from. You are certainly interested in protecting the anonymity, the privacy of members of your organization, people like them, and perhaps of anyone who suffers from AIDS. But we are continually being told now that AIDS is a growing health threat to this country, that it has now infected the heterosexual population and can be transmitted unilaterally on a heterosexual basis. We are being alarmed. What do you think we should be doing? What kind of... Go ahead.
Well, I think we should be undertaking a major prevention program for all Americans. Within the gay community, we've accomplished that. We've made tremendous strides, but the government has yet to come forward with a major prevention program that will educate everyone about how they can protect themselves. Our organization, our members, understand better than anyone else how awful this disease is because we've suffered from this disease the most. We wouldn't stand in the way of anything that would prevent its further transmission. And that's why we support major prevention programs, not revealing who has AIDS. That's not really going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is what's worked in the gay community in slowing transmission, and that's education. And the government at the federal level and the state and local levels, for the most part, have failed to come forward with the funds to really undertake that kind of program.
All right. Thank you for joining us this morning, Jeff Levi, Executive Director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Day Watch continues after this.
When you need swimsuit issue.
Now back to Day Watch on CNN.
Minnesota Public Radio has come up with a replacement for Garrison Keillor's program, A Prairie Home Companion. Keillor shocked his national audience Saturday night when he announced he's shutting the door on his fictional town of Lake Wobegon on June 13th. He says he wants to return to being a shy person. The time slot will be filled by Noah Adams, co-host of National Public Radio's All Things Considered. Adams won't continue the Prairie Home story, but will develop his own show. It may take more than money to get Elizabeth Taylor to agree on an acting role. People magazine says the violet-eyed star expects to be showered with gifts while working on a project. Case in point, the magazine says makers of the television movie Poker Alice had to come up with a little something to give Taylor on every day of their 25-day shooting schedule. One designated shopper says they bought mostly earrings, bracelets, and cigarette lighters. The total cost for the presents is about $10,000.
If you have the day off.
Down at Paris, they have some snow flurries and a temperature of 36 degrees. And that brings us right up into the International Hour, next up on CNN.
This is CNN, a service of Turner Broadcasting System.
Now a full 60 minutes of foreign news and perspective. This is the CNN International Hour.
Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev tells an international peace conference there will be no second Noah's Ark for nuclear deluge, that the nuclear guillotine must be broken. And the man accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a Nazi guard at the Treblinka death camp during World War II, goes on trial today in Jerusalem. Good afternoon and welcome to the International Hour. In Washington, I'm Bernard Shaw.
And at CNN headquarters in Atlanta, I'm Donna Kelley.
And I'm Ralph Wenge. Adolfo Calero, the best-known leader of the rebels in Nicaragua, resigned today from a group that tried to unify guerrilla opposition to the Sandinistas. Calero says the move is in the best interest of the Contras. CNN's John Zarella has a report.
During a packed news conference, Adolfo Calero announced he was stepping down as one of 3 leaders of the United Nicaraguan Opposition. UNO is the U.S.-backed rebel umbrella group which brought together the several factions fighting independently against the Sandinistas.
I have said very clearly that I am leaving for the sake of unity and nationalist spirit, to facilitate the total integration of all organizations into one organization.
Exactly how pulling out of the coalition of Contra groups will lead to increased unity was something Calero did not explain. He says he will still remain in charge of his faction, the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, which is the largest rebel army. Calero and the other members of UNO have reportedly disagreed on numerous occasions about how the war should be handled and who should be running the show, the military leaders or the political arm. But Calero says he was not pressured to resign by other members of UNO or the Reagan administration.
The only pressure I have had, and the only pressure to which I would answer, is patriotism. And patriotism is what has motivated my taking this step.
Calero says he will continue to work closely with the members of UNO, and he still is hopeful that a unified army can be formed to fight the Sandinistas. His departure and the continued turmoil within the Contra movement have remaining Contra officials worried. Some fear their internal problems will erode their political support on Capitol Hill, as well as the public's perception. John Zarella, CNN, Miami.
Here in Washington, about 40 protesters demonstrated in front of the offices of the United Nicaraguan Opposition, the political arm of the Contras. The organizers of this protest say they will demonstrate for 2 weeks in an effort to, quote, make D.C. Contra-free. The anti-Contra campaign coincides with what many on Capitol Hill think will be an especially intense debate on the question of funding for the Contras. An unnamed White House official denies that an initiative called Project Democracy had anything to do with the Iran-Contra scheme. That official, who asked not to be identified, was responding to a story reported in yesterday's New York Times. The Times reported that the Iran-Contra affair had its beginnings in the covert side of a broad policy to strengthen democracies worldwide. And according to the report, fired White House aide Oliver North was in charge. The White House official said, quote, I don't think that the things that Ollie North might have done have a